The European Union is a political and economic union of countries situated in Europe, founded with the core values of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. There are currently 28 member countries in the European Union. Not every country in Europe is a member, although Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Norway are non-member states who still belong to the European Economic Area. The European Union began in 1950 with 6 member countries, Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, who established the European Coal and Steel Agreement in order to promote cooperation and peace in Europe after the 2 World Wars. By 1993, the organization became known as the European Union, and in 1999, the official EU currency, the euro, was launched. The EU's political structure comprises 4 main sections. The European Parliament passes laws, while the European Commission proposes and enforces them. The European Council defines the priorities and direction of the EU, one of which is a strong focus on climate action. The Council of the European Union is where government ministers from member countries negotiate legislation and conclude agreements. With regard to climate change, the EU began serious climate action in the 1970s. The first major environmental issue to affect Europe was acid rain, caused by chemical runoff and emissions. After severe damage to freshwater systems and forests in Eastern Europe and Germany, the EU met with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in 1979 and signed a convention which prohibited the use of chemicals in question and constituted an early example of successful environmental protection in Europe.
The European Union's role in causing this current climate change problem that we faced is one of both historical events as well as generally how they're doing currently. Now, historically, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution happened, and it started in Britain, and it moved out through all of Europe and to North America. And this industrialization came at a great cost because they were running on fossil fuels, this charcoal, coke, and oil-fueled furnaces that powered the factories. They would take their toll in over the 100 years. And this was many years before the idea of renewable resources would ever cross the table. However, currently, the EU itself is doing a fantastic job in, well, fixing their mistake, we can call it. As of 2014, the European Union has cut down 1,315.9 million tons compared to 1990, and that is a massive drop for the EU. And we're talking about 28 countries here. And globally, the EU itself only produces 10% of the global emissions from fossil fuels. And if we look at the main 3 big countries, Germany, United Kingdom, and France, as we can see at the bottom of the screen, Germany produces 21.93% of that 10% from the EU. So globally, they barely produce over 2% for a country that was a lead exporter in goods for so many years. It's astounding how low their emissions are compared to countries like the US and China.
How will climate change affect the EU? Global warming and climate change has serious consequences on human health, biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as social and economic factors. Global warming is responsible for higher temperatures, the availability of water, rising sea levels, and a greater risk of natural disasters, including floods, droughts, and landslides. High temperature extremes, including heat waves, will affect human health and in extreme cases will consequently lead to death, specifically in the elderly. Warmer temperatures also affects plants and animal species. Warmer temperatures will lead to a diminishing ecosystem due to erosions and diminishing water reservoirs. Climate change will affect water availability throughout Europe. Reductions in river flows have already been observed in southern and eastern Europe. Changes in snow and glacier dynamics may lead to water shortages across Europe. Diminishing water supplies will negatively affect hydroelectric power, which is a principal source in many areas in Europe. Water availability will affect citizens as well as industries such as tourism, agriculture, and transportation. Sea levels have been rising due to the thermal expansion of the oceans as a result of climate change. Coasts will become more vulnerable to flooding and erosions as temperatures rise. A third of EU's population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, where these areas also generate 30% of the Union's total GDP. Rising temperatures will lead to more frequent and intense summer droughts and hence could affect the severity of fire seasons. Climate change will increase the chances of flooding across Europe. Greater risk of flash flooding with climate change, especially in mountain regions.
The European Union has a number of objectives laid out for tackling the major issue of climate change. These goals have set targets in terms of time and percentages of emission reductions. These goals are aimed at the European Union as a whole, with individual member countries having their own set percentages to aim for by the agreed time limit. The main aim of these targets is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase the percentage of renewable energy sources adopted by member countries. The target percentages are based on 1990s levels and aim for the year 2020 as a goal. The first target is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of 20% by the year 2020, based on 1990s levels. The second target is for 20% of energy sources within EU countries to be taken from renewable sources such as solar, wind, or hydroelectric. The third target aims for a 20% improvement in energy efficiency of pre-existing installations and consumer-level energy consumption. Finally, the EU aims for a realisation of Phase 3 of the emission trading system, which will limit the energy consumption of heavy installations. The emission trading system already covers roughly 45% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions, and by the year 2020 will implement a cap on energy consumption across the EU.
EU strategies. How does the EU plan on preventing climate change? So in order to reduce the impact of climate change, the EU must implement strategies. These strategies seek to reduce these impacts by the use of adaptation methods and policies implemented in order to reduce the progression of climate change as well. And these policies are in the early stages, so they're not perfect and are always being developed further. So what are the objectives the EU wishes to fulfill? Well, to create a climate-resilient Europe and increase Europe's capacity to respond to the changes in the climate, to provide financial support to members of the EU when they need it, to encourage the development of projects with demonstration and transferable potential, and to encourage the exchange of good practices between member states. There are three main adaptation strategies, the first being promoting action by members of the EU, the second, to bridge the knowledge gap, to promote better informed decision making, and the third, to promote adaptation in key vulnerable sectors, such as agriculture, fisheries and cohesion policy, and increasing resilience in building infrastructure. So the first strategy is promoting action. All member states must be encouraged to adopt comprehensive adaptation strategies. These are designed to help EU countries develop and to help them implement, revise and develop efficient climate change policies. We must also address the knowledge gap. And these gaps in knowledge include the information on damage caused by climate change, and the costs and benefits involved in adapting. Regional and local level analysis and risk assessments, framework models and tools to support decision making and assessment, and the means of monitoring and evaluating past adaptation efforts. Alright, promoting adaptation. Mainstream adaptation measures into EU policies and programs are extremely important. Adaptation has been mainstreamed into legislation sectors such as marine waters, forestry and transport, inland water, biodiversity and migration and mobility. Effort is also being invested in order to integrate adaptation into agriculture, forestry, maritime spatial planning, and coastal management, transport, research, health, and the environment. Further strategies that can be implemented are using less water, adapting building regulations, building flood defenses, and developing crops that cope better in drought conditions. The EU emission trading system is a key tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industry at the lowest cost possible. The EU countries are required to support renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, and biomass to reach the green energy targets. EU countries have to reduce the energy use of their buildings. Industries are required to improve the energy efficiency of equipment and household appliances. Also, car manufacturers have to reduce the CO2 emissions from their products.
Germany is the most powerful economy in the European Union and one of the most progressive with regard to climate action. The effects of climate change in Germany include warmer winters of higher precipitation and decreased snowfall, risks of flooding in the east, the southwest, and the Alps, and risk of droughts and water shortages in the east during summer. All of this has the potential to significantly damage Germany's forestry, agriculture, and winter tourism industries. Germany has adopted the goals of the European Union and aims by 2050 to reduce greenhouse emissions by 85 to 90% below 1990 levels, and to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. In the short term, Germany aims to achieve a 40% reduction in emissions by 2020 and to act as an international leader and role model to promote climate action worldwide. Germany's principal strategy for achieving these goals is the program Energiewende, or Energy Transition, which was launched in 2010. Energiewende includes a wide range of policies to improve energy efficiency and develop renewable energy sources. In Germany, renewable energy includes wind power, which is the cheapest option and supplies 12% of the country's power, biomass, which is highly versatile and expected to provide 2/3 of the country's power by 2020, with careful management to ensure sustainability. In photovoltaics, Germany is second only to China in total installed capacity. At its best, 33% of peak energy demand can be met through photovoltaics, and Germany has contributed greatly to the development of the technology, making it a cheaper and more viable option worldwide. Nuclear power is now being phased out. In 2016, 9 nuclear power stations currently remain open, but by 2022 the last will have been closed down. In 2015, Germany achieved 30% of their energy demand being met by renewable sources, and by 2012 they had already achieved a 24.7% reduction in harmful emissions. Additionally, technological advances have created 800,000 new jobs in the areas of renewables and energy efficiency, and Germany remains the second largest financial donor to climate action in the world.
France is currently one of the leaders in low emissions. Now, France has a history of a decline in their use of fossil fuels such as petroleum and coal, dating back to the early 80s and can be also dated back to the 50s with their use of coal dropping significantly. Now, France has still got areas of action that they're trying to take, not particularly in the areas of fossil fuel, but in areas of recycling and waste recovery, with their sea and oceans, with biodiversity and general environment and sustainable development. Now, France is affected on the many different things by climate change, including global warming, and also with a shift in rainfall. The shift in rainfall itself has caused winter and autumn rainfall to increase around up to 35%, and has in return caused flooding with some of her major rivers and smaller rivers along the mainland. Now, many of you will know that France is a nuclear power country. It runs heavily on nuclear power, and about 75% of its electricity comes from nuclear energy. And it's one of the world's largest net exporters of nuclear energy. And it gains about 3 billion per year through this. However, France does have wind farms and is currently in development solar farms for renewable energy. And France is also researching the 4th generation reactor, which represents generally a better form of nuclear power, one that's more sustainable, more safe, more reliable, and produces less waste. However, it is currently still in both research and development stage. Now, under the Kyoto Protocol, France dropped her emissions by about 7%, and globally, France actually only produces 1% of gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And that's quite impressive, seeing that France is actually one of the most industrialized countries, and it does produce about 4% of the global gross domestic product. Now, under the recent Paris Climate Conference, France has set a few targets, including a further reduction in greenhouse emissions, a increased usage of renewable energy, and has also agreed to fund about 2 billion euros into the climate funding as part of a broader increase in development aid. And they're trying to set an example to other big countries to start also increasing funding to help developing countries that can't afford, or it's not possible for them to pursue areas of renewable energy.
The United Kingdom. What are their sources of electricity? How are they affected by climate change? And what is being done to combat the effects? So there are 3 main sources of the UK's energy. These are fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and renewable energy. Fossil fuels are the UK's main source of energy, as natural gas produced 30% of the UK's energy in 2015, coal 23%, and oil under 1%. Renewable energy is the UK's second main energy source, with it making up to 25% of the UK's power in 2015. This will eventually go up and up as the UK attempts to reach the EU target of 30% by 2020. And the methods of renewable energy include wind, wave, marine, hydro, biomass, and solar. So nuclear energy produced 21% of all electricity in the UK, but it is expected that all but one of the nuclear plants in the UK will stop running by 2025. So what are the effects of climate change in the UK? Well, it's actually had a significant effect. There was a heat wave in 2003 that caused drought, forest fires, and the deaths of 2,070 people in Britain, mostly the elderly. In the northern seas, they were warming up and killing the fish, and leading to the starvation of seabirds. Flooding, rising sea levels, and extreme weather are destroying the sandy beaches and the homes along the coast and rivers. So what are the upcoming effects, or the expected effects, as climate change gets worse? Well, extremely wet winters could become up to 5 times more likely over the next 100 years. Annual damages from flooding alone could increase to between £2 billion and £12 billion by the 2080s, which is actually 10 times higher than current costs. As many as 330,000 properties are currently at risk of flooding. Climate change could increase this to as much as 1.2 million by the 2080s. 27 to 59 million people could be living in areas affected by water supply deficits by the 2050s. So, what's included in the Climate Change Act of 2008? Well, we have the 2050 target, the carbon budgets, the Committee on Climate Change, and a National Adaptation Plan. So the 2050 target is to reduce emissions by at least 80% from the levels in 1990. The budget is to place a cap on GHG emissions over 5 years. The Committee on Climate Change advises the government on emission targets and reports progress to the Parliament. And the National Adaptation Plan requires the government to assess the UK's risks from climate change and prepare strategies accordingly. So which government departments are dedicated to climate change? We have the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which leads on the UK's policy to reduce emissions, aims to deliver secure energy and encourage action against climate change. There's also the Department for Environmental and Rural Affairs, and this leads on the UK's domestic adaptation policy, and is responsible for developing a national adaptation program to address the risks, and this involves businesses, local government, civil society, and public sector organisations.
Poland stands apart from other European Union countries as a country that still invests and relies heavily on its coal industry for much of its national economy. However, Poland still has key interests in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for multiple reasons, including foreign relations and climate change. As studies have evidenced, the effects of climate change on Poland could be serious and disastrous. Effects such as major increases to the intensity and frequency of extreme weather phenomena and increases to the duration and severity of drought periods. These, coupled with more intense heat waves, especially in the southwest regions of Poland, could have a multitude of damaging effects on the ecosystem. Poland has agreed on a set of national goals in order to combat these environmental effects and to comply with international EU goals for 2020. These include a 14% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from levels measured in 2005, and an increase of 15.5% to the amount of energy consumed from renewable sources. However, there are factors that hinder Poland's participation in EU international goals for emission reductions. 90% of Poland's power is currently sourced from its coal industry, which is the largest in Europe and has been since the 1970s. Coal is Poland's main export and employs over 100,000 workers nationally. For Poland to cut its coal industry would be economically crippling, and with an economy that has been so strong and stable for so long, Polish leaders are reluctant to agree to further EU terms.
The Netherlands. The Netherlands is a low-lying country with approximately 27% of the territory lying below sea level. 2/3 of the country is vulnerable to flooding, but preventative measures such as dikes and seawalls help to reduce the land from flooding. The lowest point of the Netherlands is the city of Rotterdam, which lies 22 feet below sea level. The highest point of the Netherlands is 1,056 feet above. The strategic location of the Netherlands makes it important as a transit and trade hub. The current standing of the Netherlands is average. The Netherlands only produced 5.5% of its total energy from renewable sources in 2014. By 2020, the UE and the Netherlands aims for the country to target 14% of the gross energy consumption to be derived from renewable sources. The main energy sources in the Netherlands are natural gas, oil, and coal. Limitations. Rise in energy consumption due to economic recovery and cold winters. Politicians in the Netherlands do not deem it essential to spend money on renewable energy. Minimal hydropower in the Netherlands due to height difference in the river systems. Few cheap natural resources available and hence unable to contribute as much as other countries such as Austria. Dutch households have easy and affordable access to natural gas, and therefore most households do not use wood for natural warmth. goals by both the Netherlands and the EU. By 2020, the EU and the Netherlands aims the country to target 14% of the gross energy consumption to be derived from renewable sources. By 2020, the Netherlands government aims to build 6,000 MW of offshore wind power to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 30% compared to the 1990 level by 2020, achieving annual energy efficiency improvements by 2% by 2020. Policies. Renewable Energy Production Incentive Scheme, Energy Investment Allowance, Energy Research Subsidy, the Green Funds Scheme. This scheme encourages projects or businesses that want to invest or build in a positive effect to the environment, e.g., a project or business wanting to build sustainable houses, wind farms, or agricultural businesses can apply for a reduced interest rate loan at a Dutch bank. Renewable energy, wind energy, solar energy. This only contributed to 1.4% of renewable energy in 2010. Biomass for co-firing at power stations, biofuels for road transportation. Dutch companies who invest in energy-efficient equipment and renewable energy sources can deduct 44% of investments from their taxable profit. Wind energy. In December 2013, 1,976 wind turbines were operational on land in the Netherlands. 2 wind farms are in operation offshore. Both offshore farms helped to light over 200,000 houses. Both farms also helped the Netherlands to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 225,000 tonnes. In 2010, wind energy consumption was not as successful as previous years due to lack of wind over the winter period. Biomass. Biomass is a major source of renewable energy in the Netherlands. Companies are obliged to report annually on the quantity of biofuel they supply to the market. UE achievements to date. In 2005, the UE launched the biggest carbon trading market in the world. Major factories and companies are granted permits to how much carbon they can emit. In January 2012, the UE made it a requirement for airlines with flights arriving or departing in Europe to buy carbon permits to offset emissions from their flights. Committed to second phase of Kyoto's protocol, providing substantial funding to tackle climate change. Greater regulations. For example, UE's emission trading system is a key tool for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Car manufacturers have to reduce carbon emissions in new cars and vans. Adapting a UE adaptation strategy which includes measures such as using less water, building flood defences, developing crops that cope better in drought conditions.
Global relationships. Europe is not alone in the fight against climate change. Now, the European Union has taken action through a lot of different forms. This includes just general bilateral relations with non-EU countries, policies and initiatives between EU countries and other countries, financial support for developing countries, and the many conventions, agreements and protocols that have been held. Now, all of the European countries signed up to the Kyoto Protocol and have agreed and commenced reducing in emissions under the agreement. And under the Paris Agreement, global cooperation is hopefully going to be at an all-time high. Now, the Catholic Church has had a healthy relationship with the EU for the longest time. And though the Catholic Church itself does not fight climate change in the way of building solar panel farms and offshore wind turbines, they do support the EU and have voiced their own opinion at times. And they've also pushed the European Union to not only fight climate change, but poverty, social justice, the economy, and politics. The United States has always had a somewhat healthy relationship with the EU. However, it was a bit tricky during the time of the Kyoto Protocol, with the US not signing up and causing other countries to doubt it and also not take part. However, over the last few years, the US has begun changing policies to reduce carbon pollution and has started cooperating with the president of China and China in general to achieve a successful outcome with the Paris conference. Australia has always had a very healthy relationship with the EU, especially around the areas of climate change, especially around the Pacific region, as Australia is the largest donor in the Pacific region before the EU, and together both have been using effective cooperation to help developing countries and small island nations that are facing the real problem of climate change. The People's Republic of China has been quite cooperative with the EU. They've held summits, and they currently have joint projects with the Near Zero Emission Coal Scheme and the emission trading scheme in China that they're hoping to introduce, that will hopefully reduce China's emission levels. The Republic of India has had a quite good relationship with the EU. Similar to China, they share projects, including those of offshore wind development and optimized power engineering with biomass. Generally, the EU is helping them both industrialize and help them focus on clean energy and energy efficiency. The least developed countries, as I said with the case with the relationship with Australia, the EU helps fund developing countries through their set-up organization known as the Global Climate Change Alliance, which provides both technical and financial support, as well as people on the ground helping. And with the next budget for the EU, they're hoping to actually increase the amounts that they give to the alliance. So hopefully we'll see a greater support and help will be given to all developing countries, especially in the Pacific region. Greenpeace has had I'd say a rocky relationship with the EU. They've always monitored and analysed the work of the EU, and in short, they push the EU to test themselves, to try harder. They believe that the EU can do better than what they're putting their targets to. They believe that they can have more renewable energy by 2030 than what they're hoping to have. And they're hoping for a kind of carbon phasing out of coal at a greater speed than what is currently predicted. As well as they're hoping that the EU will act and form some form of protection for the Antarctic. especially around the North Pole.